Part 3, Pins and Needles. Chapter 54. Less than 15 minutes later, Neil and Bree were sitting in Andy's fully lit kitchen. Luckily, his house hadn't lost electricity. Still, Neil couldn't stop himself from flinching at every random creak or gust of wind. What if the ghost of Rebecca's father had followed them here and was waiting for the perfect moment to burst through the door? "Would you like some milk, sugar?" Andy asked, placing 2 steaming mugs onto the table between Neil and Bree. They usually didn't drink tea, but they nodded anyway, trying to forget about the horror that had chased them into the storm. They huddled in their chairs, wrapped tightly in the warm towels that Andy had taken out of his dryer for them. Outside, the rain had died down, but the soft pat, pat, pat of water dripping from branches onto the forest floor echoed in through Andy's screen door. After he brought a small carton of milk and a cup full of sugar to the table, Andy sat down beside Neil and Bree. "Now," he said, "tell me exactly what happened. I'm not quite sure I understand why you don't want me to call the police." The two glanced at each other, unsure how to answer. "It's okay," said Andy with a concerned smile. "You saw something, trust me, in those woods. You're not alone thinking you might be crazy." "Crazy?" "We're not sure what we saw," said Neil, "but it was scary." "I can tell." Andy leaned forward onto his elbows and clasped his hands, resting his chin on his fists, massing his beard. "Now, why you think someone would want to break into your aunt's house?" "We don't actually think someone will want to do that." Neil clasped the hot mug, warming his fingers. "You said you've seen crazy things in these woods?" Andy squinted at him. Neil proceeded carefully. "What if we told you that the person in the driveway wasn't quite alive?" Bree sat up straight, eyes wide, silently asking him what he thought he was doing. But Neil was determined. Andy might have the answers they'd been searching for. They should have talked to him sooner. "It was a ghost chasing you," Andy smirked. "Or a zombie, maybe a vampire." Seeing their horrified expressions, his bald head flushed red. "I'm sorry," he said, trying to sound sincere. Neil glanced at the clock near the stove in the corner. He didn't know when the aunts would return to the house, but he figured they had some time. At this point, what choice did he have? Neil told Andy everything he could remember. The figure in room 13, the nightly visitations, the dreams, the strange pictures on the camera. He even mentioned their trip up to Whispering Knoll and Nicholas Riley's reaction. Neil revealed the truth about Rebecca Smith's death, about reading her clue in the yearbook, about how her father's ghost had come for them. Neil theorized to stop them from revealing his secret to anyone else. As he spoke, Neil felt a weight to lift from his shoulders. Now he and Bree weren't alone. Andy looked concerned, and that was a relief. If Neil and Bree were forced to leave Hedston that night, at least someone knew what had happened at Graylock Hall. Maybe Rebecca would find the peace she so desperately sought. "That's quite a story," said Andy, shaking his head, keeping his eyes on them. "You believe us, don't you?" Bree asked. "How could I not? It's all adds up. Remarkable, actually." Then, to their surprise, Andy chuckled. "You two should write a book." Bree glanced at Neil. "Maybe we will," she said, hesitating. "Someday." "But first," said Neil, "we've got to figure out who Rebecca's father was." Bree sucked her teeth. "What I want to know is how to stop him from coming after us again." "We could get in touch with the ghostly investigators," said Neil. Bree scoffed. Andy chuckled, pushing his chair back. "That is one question I definitely cannot answer for you." He crossed around the table and headed through a darkened hallway and down a short hall. "But we can try and look him up on my computer," he called out. Neil and Bree followed him, leaving the towels draped on their chairs in the kitchen. Stepping into the darkness of the hall, they heard what sounded like a soft cry. The noise gave Neil chills. Feeling foolish, he closed his eyes, then walked faster toward the light and the comfort of Andy. When Neil entered the room, he realized that the sound hadn't been a cry, but merely the plinking of piano keys. The large instrument stood against the far wall, beside a rain-spattered window. Andy had his back to them, moving papers off a desk and opening a laptop computer. His hip brushed against the piano again. Plink, 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 plink. Neil sighed. His mind was still filled with Rebecca's story. He needed to stop, to take a deep breath, to... Bree grabbed his hand so suddenly, Neil nearly screamed. When he tried to pull away, he caught a glimpse of her face, and it froze him solid. Her eyes were wide, her lips pressed together so tightly that the skin around them was white. Cords of muscle stood out from her neck, and, for a moment, Neil wondered if she was having a seizure. But then, Bree flicked her eyes toward the wall behind them. She shook her head slightly, with a quiet violence, as if to say, "Not a word." Slowly, Neil turned. His body went numb, his eyes completely dry. He clenched his jaw and didn't even blink when he tasted the blood he'd drawn from his tongue. He felt as though the entire world was spinning too quickly. At any moment, gravity would stop holding him down. He'd hit the ceiling, and that would be it. And maybe, right now, that would be for the best. Above the stone fireplace, hanging from the dark, wood-paneled walls, a pair of deer antlers appeared to be reaching for him, sharp little skewers that could poke out his eyes if he got too close. Below the mantelpiece, in the mouth of the fireplace pit, a pair of black andirons held up 3 white logs. Neil knew it was birchwood. He'd seen them several times before, pictures of them at least. Neil turned away from the fireplace as quickly as he could. Andy threw him a strange glance, as if he suspected the terrified thoughts rushing through their heads. "What's the matter?" he asked. "You look like you've seen—" He chuckled. "Oh, heck, I'll say it. You look like you've seen a ghost." "Nope," said Bree, forcing her voice into an unnatural-sounding calmness. "No ghosts. Still a little freaked out from before, that's all." She let go of Neil's hand and stepped back toward the door. "You know, maybe my aunts are home now. Can we use your phone?" "Of course," said Andy, nonplussed. He gestured to a small table next to the piano bench where his phone sat. Neil trembled when he saw a large pile of sheet music stacked on the bench, on top of which lay Superstition by Stevie Wonder. Neil squeezed his fists to keep himself from shaking. Andy rose and stood between them and the door. "Anna's probably dying of worry." He leaned against the wall and watched them expectantly. Neil noticed a framed document hanging on the wall at Andy's shoulder. A certificate of commendation from the local Kiwanis Club. A name leaped out from the center of the frame. Andrew Curtin. Curtin? It was Alice's last name, Rebecca's mother. But how? Neil wondered frantically. We saw the killer's ghost back at the aunt's house. Andy noticed the alarm written on Neil's face and turned to see what had caught his attention. As he studied the certificate, his concerned expression transformed, looking both happy and sad, as if he had resigned himself to a difficult task. After a few seconds, he spoke. "Rebecca was never my daughter," he said. Bree dropped the phone receiver and turned around. "But her mother was my wife. Our relationship was complicated, but eventually the girl did learn to think of me as her father." "Daddy." Andy reached down and allowed his hand to brush against the iron fireplace instruments, a brush, a shovel, a pair of tongs. But the piece he ended up wrapping his fingers around was longer, heavier, and sharper than the rest. The fireplace poker had a hooked tip. "Unfortunately, that didn't last very long," he said, stepping quickly toward them, his boots falling heavy against the hardwood floor. Chapter 55. The room flickered, and, for a moment, a series of images flashed through Neil's mind. Andy stood in a different position, closer to the fireplace. He was shouting, towering over the woman from the yearbook memorial. Alice Curtin, his wife and Rebecca's mother. Behind Andy, in the doorway, Rebecca cowered, an iron mask of terror locked upon her face. Then Alice was lying on the floor, her hair matted with blood. On the way down, she'd hit her head on the andirons. The white birch logs were now spattered with red. "Mama!" Rebecca screamed. Andy focused on the girl, swaying as if he was having a difficult time staying on his feet. Neil understood that the man had been drinking. "It was an accident," Andy said, wide-eyed, guilt oozing from his lips. "You pushed her!" Rebecca raced past him to cradle her mother's head in her lap. "Mama, wake up!" she pleaded. "Please wake up!" Andy gripped Rebecca's bicep, her skin at his fingertips turning white. She peered up at him with a look of hatred and fear, but said nothing more. When Andy spoke, his voice was low. "She slipped!" Neil knew instantly that there existed a different kind of haunting than those he'd seen on television with Alexi and Mark. Here was the ghost of Rebecca's memory. She sent him all those pictures, the antlers, the piano bench, the birch logs, because she needed him to enter this room. The energy was powerful here. She was using it to tell him the rest of her story, just as she'd used the electricity from the aunt's house to try to show Neil and Bree who had chased her through the reeds at Graylock Lake. Neil recognized now that what he and Bree experienced earlier that night had not been the ghost of Rebecca's father coming for them, but the memory of her last moments on Earth. She'd been trying to reveal his identity. The visions continued. Andy bringing Alice's body out to the road, calling the police himself to report a hit and run. Andy visiting Rebecca in her room late at night after everything was over. "Promise me you won't tell." Rebecca only staring back at him, her eyes wide with fear, keeping her mouth shut, as if that was what he needed to see in order for him to believe her. "Who else knows about this?" Andy stood before them, clutching the fireplace poker like a police baton. "You mentioned your friends Eric and Wesley. What about Anna and Claire?" "No one knows anything," Bree answered quickly, backing up against the couch. Andy cocked his head. "What did you think would happen when you started digging around? That you learned the truth about Rebecca and everything will be fine afterward? You go back to your life in New Jersey?" he said venomously. "Who cares about what happens to the folks up here in Headston? The ones who had to deal with all this nonsense the first time around, right?" Against all better judgment, Neil opened his mouth. "So we were supposed to close our eyes, ignore what we were seeing?" "Why not? It's what everyone else did." Andy's eyes sparked with lightning fury. A moment later, surprisingly, he seemed to let it go. He sighed. "None of this was supposed to happen." Neil agreed silently. "Rebecca was a troubled girl," Andy said, sounding full of regret. "More than anyone knew. But I loved her. You have no idea what she was capable of. The manipulation. When I found out about that poem in the yearbook, my heart almost stopped. She practically begged them to put her away in that place. Though why she'd want to be locked up is beyond me. It was an insane request. Maybe the doctors were right. She was very sick." Bree spoke up. "You think Rebecca made it all up?" "Oh, I'm sure she believed that I was guilty for all the bad things that happened to our family. But it's only natural for children to blame their parents for their own problems." This last sentence was like a knife to Neil's gut, as if Andy had meant for it to hurt. He'd flung it so casually, heartlessly. "Come on!" Andy nodded toward the door. "I'll drive you home." Bree flinched. "You will?" Andy sniffed, offended. "Your family is probably worried to death. Do you have another suggestion?" Bree quickly shook her head. "No, sir." Outside, Neil marched silently next to Bree as Andy followed behind them, dragging the poker through the dirt. Neil did not believe they were going home. If Andy had intended to let them go, why had he brought the fireplace poker with him? Maybe he'd simply forgotten he was holding it. Andy had figured out what Rebecca had written in the yearbook. Daddy did it. That could have been what had tightened the screw. He'd come for her at Graylock during that long-ago storm to stop her from talking again. If he had no qualms disposing of his own stepdaughter, then what were his neighbor's niece and nephew worth when it came to maintaining his illusion of innocence? Unless he was being truthful and Rebecca had lied. Or maybe he'd gotten it wrong. Maybe he was confused in life and in death. Neil was kicking himself for not leaving a note before they left the house earlier that night. But then he wondered if a note would only have put the aunts and their father in danger when they inevitably came knocking on Andy's door. If Andy was innocent, he let them go. If not, they had to run. Now. Neil grabbed his sister's hand. Together they dashed into the wet bushes at the edge of the driveway, the darkness of the woods swallowing them whole. Chapter 56. They ran, nearly blind. Mud and muck and leaves stuck to their clothes, creating a natural camouflage. An occasional remnant of lightning lit the sky. The night made the seemingly endless woods treacherous. Low branches and tree roots reached out from both above and below, trying to ensnarl them, as if nature itself were hungry for their taste of their blood. Still, the more distance Neil put between himself and Andy's house, the better he felt. Somewhere behind them, Andy called out. His deep bellow was familiar. Rebecca had remembered the sound of it for them back at the aunt's house. Moments later, the truck's engine rolled over, then groaned to life. "The roads will be the first place he'll look," said Bree, struggling to catch her breath. They splashed upon wet ground. Water soaked their ankles. The sky lit up once more, and the island shined through the trees in the distance, its dark building appearing like a slumbering monster. The gravel path extended from the entrance and into the trees like a slobbering tongue. "Once we reach the bridge," Neil whispered, "we'll find the way home through the woods." They circled around the edge of the lake, following the tall reeds that marked where the deeper water began. They listened closely to the sounds of the forest, rain dripping from leaves, the wind creaking branches above them. As Neil trudged along, he waited for the telltale sound of Andy's boots splashing through the floodplain, but it never came. When they were about halfway to the concrete bridge, he asked his sister if she shared the visions Rebecca had shown him in Andy's parlor. "It was so weird," she answered, nodding. "It all happened so fast, like a dream." She wiped at her face. "I don't understand why." "What do you mean?" Neil asked. "I mean, why would Rebecca show us all that and then leave us alone to deal with him?" Her voice quavered, growing almost too loud to be discreet. She caught herself and, whispering once more, added, "Is he trying to get us killed?" Neil flinched. He hadn't considered that. Bree had said it herself a few days ago. Ghost stories were always sad. If Rebecca was lonely, what might she do to change that, to keep a couple of new friends to herself up here at Hedston? What if the visions she'd been sending them hadn't merely been messages? What if her breadcrumbs were meant to lead them directly into the wolf's den? If so, her plan had worked so far. "We can't think about that right now," said Neil. "Let's get home." After hiking up a small incline, they reached the gravel path that led to the hospital. Beyond the chain-link fence that sagged across the path on their left, Graylock Hall waited, as if it had been expecting them to return for a permanent stay. Shivering with a chill that went beyond dampness, beyond cold, Neil pointed across the road, deeper into the woods. "This way." Bree grabbed his arm. "What was that?" Just then, a pair of headlights flashed on, blinding them. Several hundred feet to their right, Andy's truck sat with its engine off. Neil and Bree froze, unsure which way to go. With the lights illuminating a good portion of the forest, Andy would see whatever direction they ran. Any way they went, he'd be on them within seconds. Neil thought about that sharp hook at the end of Andy's fireplace poker. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched Bree shudder. He suddenly had an idea, a dangerous idea, but it might have been their only option. "Come on," he said. "If we make it to the water, we can swim out. Hide on the other side of the lake until we're sure he's gone." "What about the weeds? Isn't that how Rebecca—" "We'll just have to be careful," he interrupted. Bree groaned in protest. "We have no choice." Up the road, the truck's engine roared to life, and the headlights lurched forward. Chapter 57. Neil and Bree leaped off the road and scurried down the incline, bypassing the chain-link fence, which towered high on the threshold of the bridge above them. When they reached the reeds and the shadows at the water's edge, the bright lights went out and the engine died with a whimper. Somewhere in the darkness, they heard Andy curse. He obviously hadn't meant for the truck to lose power. The reeds were thick. Neil and Bree had to push hard through them. Mud sucked at their feet, trying unsuccessfully to hold them in place. Carefully, they made their way into the bog. The first wall of greenery closed behind them, hiding them from the possibility of Andy seeing them in the water. Up on the road, they heard the truck door open. Footfalls scattered stones across the path. A crunching sound came down the incline toward the water's edge. Andy had seen them descend. Neil and Bree forced themselves forward, the water growing deeper, lapping at their waists now. Lily pads swirled all around them, long stalks entangling their legs. With every step, Neil found it harder to move. Just ahead of him, Bree bent down, trying to pull the plants away from her body. Briefly, Neil imagined gray hands emerging from the water, grabbing his sister and dragging her under. He quickly blinked the thought away. Coming down this way was a mistake. There was no way they'd make it past this barrier toward the open water. They should have taken their chances back in the forest. A loud whooshing noise slashed the air behind them. Andy was using the poker to break through the reeds. Straining forward, Neil couldn't help but imagine how strange it would be to die in the same way as Rebecca. Remembering his frightening dreams, Neil thought with an odd giddiness, "At least I already know what it'll feel like. Pins, needles, and infinite darkness." "Neil," Bree whispered, bringing him back to reality. "I can't." She was stuck, her hands trapped below the surface. "No," he insisted, pushing at her shoulders. "Don't stop." To his horror, Neil watched Bree sway forward under his touch, rippling the water's lily pad cover as her feet sank in the muck. But at the last moment, just before her head went under, something strange happened. Bree wrenched her arms up in front of herself and then jerked forward several feet toward Graylock Island. Neil saw his sister land with a groan on the steep shore. If he didn't know any better, he'd have thought someone had pulled his sister to safety. Another whack of the reeds came from close by. Andy was making his way quickly through the water behind them. Neil tried to pick up his feet, but the harder he heaved, the more the mud sucked on his sneakers, as if it wanted him to stay put. Something brushed his face. It felt soft, fleshy. Neil nearly screamed. Then he heard a voice in his ear. "Shh." A dim shape appeared before him, reaching out as if from inside an impossible pocket of darkness near the shore. 5 delicate fingers wavered slightly. A hand. It came closer. Neil gasped. When another splash sounded from the water behind him, he instinctively took hold of it. A sharp, icy cold enclosed his wrist with surprising strength. Neil felt his breath being stolen from his lungs. Before he knew it, he was lying on the beach. Speechless, Bree grabbed his arms and helped him to his feet. Dizzy with confusion, they sprinted up the small embankment together and found themselves standing amidst the rows of tall pines that lined the rocky path to the hospital. Another slicing sound came from the water at the base of the bridge. Another curse. Andy was nearly at the opposite side of the small channel. "Which way?" Bree said to Neil, glancing back toward the chain-link fence. Imagining what might happen if they got caught in its teeth, Neil shook his head. Everything that happened that week had led to this moment, this decision whether or not to seek refuge in the empty asylum or to enter its shadows and hide from the man who had killed Rebecca Smith. The ghost had wanted this to happen, but, Neil wondered as he reluctantly turned with Bree to face Graylock Hall, can we trust her? Chapter 58. Gravel and dirt spat up from their shoes as they splashed through sodden ground. Their wet clothes clung to their skin. The hailstones had mostly melted, and the sky that had created them was almost clear. A bright white half-moon was coming up over the horizon ahead. Neil and Bree raced along the side of the building, past the boarded-up window where they'd first entered the hospital, toward the shattered patio at the other end of the island. Their ears pounded with sounds of their own making, so that by the time they reached that broken back door, they were both unsure if Andy had heard where they'd gone. Standing on the concrete among the invasive weeds, Neil grabbed the handle of the door to the youth ward, feeling both panic and relief when it turned. Pulling the door open with a nearly imperceptible slowness, he managed to dampen the possibility of squealing hinges until he'd opened a wide enough gap for Bree to squeeze through. He followed her briskly onto the platform just inside. Then, just as slowly as before, he closed the door, wishing there was a way to lock it. All they had left was a slight hope that they'd been quiet enough to escape. They only needed to hide in here until they were sure that Andy had given up, gone home. And then what? Neil knew Andy wouldn't stop there. What about Wesley and Eric? What about the ants? No. He and Bree couldn't merely hide. They needed to get back, to warn everyone else, to tell them what they learned. Someone was walking outside the door. Heavy boots kicked gravel. Neil's heart sank. He imagined that fireplace poker reaching out for the doorknob, the hook catching hold. Neil held the inside handle as tightly as he could, his palms slipping over the smooth metal. The door rattled. Bree took hold of the handle as well, leaning backward with all her weight. But it wasn't enough. The door creaked slowly outward. Through the slight crack that appeared, Andy peeked in at them. His eyes were wide, lifeless, practically robotic. The man had a mission. He would not be talked out of it. Raising his top lip in a canine grimace, Andy threw his shoulder backward, yanking the door even further open. Neil and Bree strained with every ounce of strength to simply hold on, and somehow they managed to keep their feet just inside the jam. "I can't," said Bree, her strength fading. "Let go," Neil whispered. "On 3. He nodded and they released the door. Andy stumbled backward. They had only seconds to run. The staircase led up to the youth ward's common room and down to the mystery depths of the boiler room. It wasn't even a choice which direction they take. At the top step, Neil and Bree slammed themselves against the cage gate. It swung wide and hit the wall. Behind them, the outside door yawned open too. Neil reached out and shut the cage as Andy burst through the entry onto the platform at the bottom of the stairwell. He glanced up at them, clutching the poker in both hands. Then he came, taking steps 2 at a time. Bree dragged Neil to the other side of the cage just as Andy used the hook to smack the mess door open. Andy pulled himself into the common room, swinging around the corner as Neil and Bree clambered to the opposite side and the stairwell leading to the bedrooms above. They slammed this next gate shut, but it swung open again, refusing to catch. Andy approached, chortling a wheeze of triumph. Bree paused at the bottom step, her fingers sticking through the small diamond-shaped openings in the wires, trying to latch the cage door before Andy could work it open again. Andy raised his hook and slammed it against the metal. Bree screamed and pulled her fingers out of the way as the mess was crushed, but the latch held. When Andy tried to pull the door open again, it caught with a jolt. He'd smashed the cage so hard, the crushed metal had blossomed inward, creating a makeshift lock, putting a barrier between himself and his target. Realizing his error, Andy released a howl of anger that echoed through the room. Neil wanted to sneer, to stick out his tongue or worse, but Bree was already halfway up the stairs, calling for him to follow her. When Neil turned back, he found that the common room was empty. Andy had already gone. Chapter 59. Upstairs, blocks of blue moonlight spilled through the open bedroom doors, illuminating the otherwise pitch-black corridor. Bree and Neil stood at the beginning of the hall, glancing back and forth between the direction they come and the darkness they knew they would find ahead. Bree held Neil's hand, and he felt very young. He thought he could feel her heartbeat pulsing in her fingertips. If this had been some other place, some other time, he would have pulled away, left her alone, maybe even made fun of her. But here he understood that inside that thrumming feeling, that beating beneath their skin, the same blood flowed through their veins. He knew he needed her, now and for the rest of their lives, however long that happened to be. Wind battered the building, and something knocked against the nearby windows. Twigs, leaves, remnants of the storm. Bree squeezed his fingers even tighter. "It's just how we left it," Neil whispered. It was something to say. His voice sounded funny up here, lonely, loud. From down the stairs, a clanging noise echoed through the common room. "He's looking for another way up," Bree said. "We have to get out of here." Neil glanced down the stairs at the busted mess gate. "But the door's stuck." Releasing a measured sigh, Bree stepped into a puddle of moonlight that shimmered out from the closest room. "Then we need to look for another way down." At the end of the hall, they turned the corner and met a wall of darkness. Stepping lightly, noiselessly, they passed the point where Neil was certain they'd first encountered Rebecca Smith. Room 13. The shadows here were so dark, they almost seemed to be filled with color, in the way strange shapes sometimes appear behind your eyelids if you press on them. Where was Rebecca now, he wondered. Was he watching them? She'd pulled them from the lake, but did that mean she was on their side, or did she simply wish that they'd die here instead? They felt their way along the walls to another bend, another double doorway, another hall. "What do you think happened back there?" Neil whispered as they blindly continued on. "At the aunt's house, when we heard Andy calling Rebecca's name." "It wasn't Andy, obviously," said Bree after several seconds and several footsteps. "It was Rebecca's memory, wasn't it? I mean, that's what's been haunting us all this time. Andy's voice, his apparition, was just another part of it. What I don't get is why would Rebecca reveal that part only now? What's so different about tonight than any other night we've been here?" "Dad came to bring us home," said Neil. "If Rebecca's ghost has been learning how to show herself to us, to tell us the truth about what happened to her at Graylock, that she might have had a reason to blast us with everything she had." They come to another part of the hallway lined with windows. For the moment, they could see each other. "Yeah," said Bree, stepping quickly past a long-forgotten wheelchair shoved against the wall. "Maybe Rebecca needed the storm and all of the electricity to reveal who killed her." "But we never saw his face," said Neil. "She didn't reveal who killed her." "Sure she did. She got us to call Andy. She knew we'd find her clues at his house, the antlers, the piano bench, and the birch logs." "She set us up," said Neil, wishing he could stay where he stood, in the light of the moon. But the darkness of the hall ahead seemed to call to him. Forward was their only option. "Maybe," said Bree, pulling him along. "But maybe not. She didn't ask us to tell her father everything we knew." "Still," Neil whispered, dragging his heels on the rough linoleum. "How are we supposed to know who he was, what he'd done?" Bree huffed. It's too late now to worry about that. Way too late, said Neil. He stopped and managed to hold Bree in place. With her arm outstretched, she knew and threw him an irritated glance, bug-eyed, the ones he was so good at. Please, he whispered, his voice sounding as if it belonged to someone else, someone both older and younger than him, as if it were possible to be those two things at once. Tell me we'll get home okay, that everything is going to be fine. He didn't care if it wasn't true, he just needed to hear her say it. I promise, said Bree. Her words were like an impossible glimmer of light in deep water. When they crossed into the new line of shadow and their eyes adjusted to the darkness again, Bree and Neil found themselves standing in front of another door. Bree nudged it open with her toe. The hinges popped as the door swung against the wall. Inside, a desk sat against a line of windows that looked out upon thick pine branches. Beyond those, moonlight flicked silver flecks off the surface of the lake. Wait a second, said Neil, glancing at the wall next to the desk. He strolled over to it, reached out, and his hand disappeared into a recessed cavity in the stone. I know where we are. Bree followed, and together they peered into the opening. There was just enough moonlight to show them several steps spiraling down. This is the way Eric came that first day, when he found us in the ballroom. These stairs lead all the way down to the basement. Chapter 60. The steps were slick, the stone walls damp. Neil felt a fingertip trail as he felt his way along, twisting slowly into the depths of the building. His sister's breath hushed in his ear, a comforting signal. In his blindness, his imagination soon began to buzz. He imagined turning around to find himself alone. What he thought had been Bree would turn out to be nothing, or worse, something else. You there, he whispered, to be sure. His voice came out a little too loud. He wished he could catch it as it echoed up and down the stairwell. Yes! Bree touched his shoulder and he felt better, even as he wondered where Andy might have gone. Maybe he'd be waiting for them back at the bridge. Don't think about that, he told himself as they passed a small landing and continued down. After another short while, Neil's foot met liquid instead of stone. He splashed up to his knee as he nearly fell face first into the cold water. Somehow in the dark, Bree managed to catch his arm before he toppled over and doused himself completely. The storm flooded the basement, Neil said. How deep? Neil took another step and sank down to his waist. Reaching forward, he knew that they had several more stairs before the bottom. Pretty deep, I'm not sure. Do we swim in? Bree sighed. To where? The boarded-up window? Maybe we could use that desk we climbed in on to get back up and out. But how are we supposed to find leverage when half the gym is underwater? Neil didn't want to say that he knew what they were both thinking. He squeezed his eyes shut, discovering the same blackness there as when they were open. We have to find another way. Turning back, they climbed back to the landing. Neil felt for the wall. This must have been where... Before he could finish, he managed to knock open the bookshelf door that Eric had come through on that first day. Before them, the old ballroom appeared, lit dimly by the night spilling in through the tall windows. They stood in the doorway, listening to the silence, alert for any indication that someone was waiting for them there. A breath, a footstep, a rustle of clothing, a shifting of weight. A trickle of water echoed faintly from somewhere nearby, but that was all. The crows that had met them here several days ago had found shelter elsewhere. The two were alone. Stepping into the room, Neil turned toward the door that he knew was on the far right wall. Wait, said Bree. That just leads back into the maze of corridors. But there's no other way, said Neil. There's the flooded basement or... But Bree glanced at the windows across the room. His heart fell. You want us to jump? He asked. I wouldn't say want, Bree answered, stepping further into the room. More like need. Come on, don't think about it or you'll chicken out. We could get seriously hurt. It's a long fall. Well, we're not safe in here either. Andy could be anywhere right now. I personally don't want to find him waiting for us around some corner. Neil shuddered. He knew she was right. Fine, but be careful. I can't carry you home by myself if you break a bone. As if that was the worst that could happen. And watch out for the floor, he said. It's weak. I remember. Together, they stepped toward the broken window in the furthest corner, the one beside the giant mantelpiece where the crows had deserted them. Several panes of glass were shattered, but the frame was intact, even though they were careful to avoid the jagged hole that had tried to claim Neil as his victim. The floor groaned and whined, sounding like a tired child on the verge of a violent temper tantrum. Feeling safe enough near the sill, Bree grounded her feet and pulled up on the wooden sash, but it refused to budge. Locked? Asked Neil. Stuck, I think. Just break the rest of it. A crash echoed through the room as the far door, the one that led back into the hospital wings, flung open and hit the wall. As Neil and Bree turned, they saw a white streak enter the room and quickly disappear. What was that? Said Bree, pressing herself against the frame. Shh! Neil waved her quiet. Listen. From down the hall, they heard a flurry of footsteps. Someone was running toward them. The sound grew louder as the person barreled along. Even from far away, he managed to shake the floor. Wham! 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 Neil and Bree instinctively crouched beside the rolled-up carpet that sat beneath the length of windows. They huddled as close together as they could, trying to shrink, to hide inside darkness. The sounds, the tremors, stopped. In the doorway across the room, Andy stood, his chest quickly rising and falling. He was still clutching the hooked poker. For a moment, Neil was certain that he couldn't see them. The man stepped forward. Sorry, kids, said Andy through harsh breath. Didn't. Chapter 61. But then he stood there. There wasn't enough light to see Andy's face, but his crooked posture showed confusion. I saw you come in here, Bree, he said. That wasn't us, Neil thought. You were chasing your dead stepdaughter. After several seconds, Andy snorted. He entered the room, his boots heavy on the wood floor. Ain't too many places to hide in here. You two might as well come here. He took another step. The building creaked. Neil held his breath as Bree dug her fingers into his arm. If they stood now, would they have time to work the window open and smash apart the rest of the wood frame? Andy's eyes would soon adjust, and then he'd see them. Crouched in the corner, Neil and Bree were sitting ducks. Hoping his sister would follow his lead, Neil leaned forward, gathering the strength to stand, to reveal himself. But then a tiny silver light flickered in the center of the room, and Neil's brain felt as if it turned off. He watched in awe as the light expanded, filling the darkness with a dim glow, until a shape had formed, a whitish silhouette, a girl. A voice filled the room, sounding both distant and close, an echo from a world next to our own. Daddy! Rebecca. Why? She lifted her arms toward Andy as if calling him into her embrace, and then she was gone. Andy stood frozen halfway across the room. In the dim light that spilled into the room outside, Neil could make out the old man's gaping mouth. Bix, he said, his voice high and quavering. Is that you? He glanced all around the room, as if she might still be near, listening. How? He added, as his eyes fell on the mantelpiece, and then to the floor beside it. His expression changed quickly from awe to surprise, to anger. He shuddered, shivering off the memory of his stepdaughter as if it were no more than a large cobweb he'd accidentally walked through. You! He was looking right at them now. Neil stood slowly. Leave us alone, he shouted. Andy came closer. The hook swung at his side. How did you do that? he said. "How did you make her voice?" "We didn't do anything for you," said Bree, coming up beside her brother, "and neither did Rebecca." Andy glowered, his brow growing even darker. "You don't know anything about her, about us." "We know plenty, more than most people in this town," said Neil. "Too bad for you." Andy raised his hand, clutching the fireplace poker like a baseball bat. Then he dashed toward them, his boots shaking the floor dangerously. Neil turned toward the window. "Bree, go." He watched as she lifted her foot to kick out what was left of the broken window frame. Just as the wood shattered, something caught his shirt collar, Andy's hook. He felt a ripping pain light his neck ablaze. The world tipped upside down. Bree screamed, a siren of panic. Neil landed on his back and briefly glimpsed the ceiling high above him. An immense pressure squeezed at his back, and when he tried to catch air into his lungs, nothing came. He couldn't breathe. Wide-eyed, he struggled to roll over and dislodge the hook from his collar. Andy lay sprawled out behind him, his legs stuck into the floor. Dazed but determined, Andy reached out for the poker, capturing the handle once more in his fist. He pushed himself away from the floor, a sad but satisfied look in his eyes. "Neil!" Bree cried. "Get up!" Neil managed to inhale a minuscule amount of breath. He tried to move, but he felt as though all strength had left his body. Andy was kneeling now, pulling his leg from the ragged gap. He raised the poker. Neil closed his eyes. His mind went blank for an instant before filling with noise. His own voice crying, "No, no, 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 no." A great cracking sound interrupted his plea. The entire building seemed to shake. The floor tilted. Neil slid forward toward Andy, who'd lost his balance, wobbling sideways. Neil reached out, searching for something to hold as the floor disintegrated beneath him. Chapter 62. "Neil!" Bree screamed. Dangling on the edge of a new precipice, Neil grasped a piece of solid planking. He glanced up to find his sister perched safely on the edge of the broken windowsill. On his right, a few feet away, Andy clung to splintered remnants of the ballroom floor. The iron poker slipped out of his grasp and tumbled into the darkness below, landing after several seconds with a splash in the flooded basement. It was a long drop. Deadly, Neil thought. Dust swirled all around, and as Neil found his breath, he began to choke. "Stay where you are," said Bree. "I'm coming to get you." Don't move," Neil managed to say. "You'll fall too." Andy clambered forward, struggling to pull himself from the cavity. But the floor shuddered again, and he lost his grip. "Okay," said Bree. "Just go slowly. Come toward me. Take my hand." Neil tried, but as he released his left hand, he felt himself slipping. "I can't," he said. Bree glanced up. In shock, she stared over his shoulder toward the spot where Andy was struggling. Neil swiveled carefully and saw what had captured her attention. For a moment, he forgot where he was. He forgot everything. Rebecca had returned. This time, she was no mere glimmer. She stood on the broken floor in front of her stepfather, dressed in her dirty hospital gown. Dirt caked her feet and ankles. Her dark hair hung like lakeweed, draping her shoulders. Her face looked as it had in her final yearbook picture, empty, angry. But she was no longer helpless, and she knew it. "Daddy!" Her voice with her now filled the room. Andy froze. "Honey!" he responded, as if she were as alive as an apple tree in autumn. "Please, help me!" He reached out for her, but she looked away. Rebecca saw Neil. She saw Bree. She stared, but she did not acknowledge them. Neil's hope that she might help him was dashed when she turned back toward her stepfather and reached one foot over his head. Neil didn't have time to scream before she brought her heel down on the floor. The wood collapsed with an ear-splitting blast. Andy screeched and slipped away into the shadows. Ah! Neil's head rang, and he struggled to maintain his grip as his fingers slid from the wet board. At the windowsill, Bree reached for him, her eyes filled with panic. "Hurry!" she said. Neil reached out for her, but the planking he clung to gave a final squeal and pulled away from the wall. As he fell, the last thing Neil heard was his sister's horrified scream. Her face shrunk into nothingness, a pinpoint of terror, before it disappeared altogether. From below came a painful jolt. Then a cold and serene darkness embraced him. Chapter 63. Huddled on the windowsill, Bree clutched at the frame as the floor disappeared, taking her brother with it. She screamed so loud her eyes teared up. The building shook with a terrible violence, as if it were releasing years of unspent rage at having been left alone out here in these woods. Bree briefly imagined the walls crumbling, the ceiling tumbling, the possibility of her own body crushed in the coming rubble. She didn't care about any of that. All that mattered right now was saving Neil. Bree turned away from the cloud of dust that had risen from the destruction and swung her legs over the jagged windowsill. Looking down, she knew the grass below was dangerously far away, but she didn't hesitate. As she slipped forward, an excruciating pain bloomed as the window's broken glass cut through her jeans. Then she was falling. The earth rose up quickly to meet her. She managed to roll into it. The soft ground broke her fall. Ignoring the pain and the damp sensation in her hamstrings, she stood and kicked out a window adjacent to the one that had been boarded up. Neil was in there somewhere. She called his name but received no answer. Hesitating only briefly, she leaped inside, splashing into the detritus, twisting her ankle by landing partially on a long wood plank. The water shocked her. Her body buzzed with fear and hurt. When she tried to find the floor with her feet, she realized that she was nearly chest deep. She called Neil's name again. Pieces of the ceiling continued to rain down, some close enough to splatter her face with wet particles of plaster and splinters of wood. With no small effort, she pushed through chunks of debris that bobbed on the water surface. As she searched, Bree imagined Andy's cold hook clutching her ankle and pulling her under. She began to panic, her lungs tight, her vision slanted. Then, miraculously it seemed, she came upon Neil's body. Impossibly, he was sprawled out face down on top of a table that was floating below one of the basketball hoops. His clothes were soaked, his hair a wet and matted mess. All thought left her but two words: thank God. She touched his face. It was surprisingly warm. Though he was unconscious, his breath greeted the palm of her hand like a small blessing. Glancing up, she noticed the jagged hole through which he'd fallen. Deep inside a dark part of her mind, Bree knew that something had saved him, pulled him upon the table's surface, but she wouldn't allow herself to imagine who or what it had been. All she knew was that they needed to get out of there before the rest of the building came tumbling down. Holding onto the platform that held Neil's body aloft, Bree maneuvered several fallen boards against the wall, making a ramp upon which she dragged her brother out of the flood. Halfway to the window, the wood groaned beneath their weight. Bree scrambled faster, remembering a science class lesson about how adrenaline gave people strength they couldn't usually access. Grasping his forearms, she managed to drag Neil up and over the threshold. Outside, just as she inhaled a gasp of damp night air, she turned and saw something that took that breath away. An arm sticking out from underneath a heavy support beam. The rest of the body was face down in the water. Andrew Curtin was not moving. Bree shuddered as she realized with certainty that he'd never move again. For a moment, a wave of guilt crashed down upon her. This was not what she'd meant to happen. But then she looked down at Neil, and the guilt gave way to anger. She clutched her brother's limp body and pulled him further from the building, embracing him, trying to warm him up. Shivering, she rubbed at his arms, his chest, trying to awaken whatever spark of life he had left inside him. "Please, please," she said to anyone who might be listening. Seconds later, Neil opened his eyes and saw his sister's face. They both burst into tears. Chapter 64. A few days later, the revelations of Andy's crimes whipped through Headston and the surrounding area. Some people believed that there had always been something strange about the man, an empty look in his eye, the fact that he continued to live alone so far out in the woods. Others refused to accept that he'd be capable of hurting anyone at all. To them, he was still Andy, good friend and kind neighbor. At the pie shop, everyone had an opinion. As strange as their niece and nephew's story was, the aunts were certain that they were telling the truth, or at least most of it. What was most important to them, of course, was that Neil and Bree, who'd been scratched up and severely bruised, recover at their home as quickly as possible. The police opened an investigation, discovering blood evidence near the fireplace in the Curtin's den, exactly where Neil and Bree had said it would be. The state was able to tie the DNA sample to Alice, corroborating their story. When the local news covered the story, Neil and Bree were able to keep the promise they'd made to Mrs. Riley, the one about revealing the truth of Nurse Janet's legacy. Not long afterward, her son Nicholas called the pie shop to apologize for harassing them. Claire and Anna had no idea who he was or what he was talking about. Even though the specter of Nurse Janet was finally laid to rest, there was a new tale for the children of Headston to share in the dead of night. The legend of Rebecca Smith, the Ghost of Graylock, who, with a little help from the living, had managed to avenge her own murder from beyond the grave. Several months after returning to New Jersey, Neil was keeping in touch with Wesley, chatting online and on the phone every now and again. To Neil's surprise, he'd overheard Bree talking with Eric a few times, mostly about music and new bands they thought each other might like. His mother, Linda, continued to see her doctors. At home, Neil was happy to find her beginning to act like herself again, mostly, as Linda explained, because he realized that she was actually better off without Rick, who'd taken the hint and rented an apartment in Manhattan where he could keep trying to live out that dream of his. He even had a spare room for when his kids came to visit. His family was changing. It wasn't easy, it never would be, but Neil understood that it was for the best. One night in late October, while Nee, Bree, and Linda were eating dinner together, the phone rang. Neil answered. A woman introduced herself and explained that she was a producer for a television program called Ghostly Investigators. Neil nearly dropped the receiver. "Hello, Mr. Katie, are you there?" I'm here," Neil stammered. His mother and sister watched from the kitchen table. "No one's ever called me Mr. Katie before." "Okay, Neil, well, Alexi and Mark heard all about your experience up in Hudson. They want to do a show about Graylock Hall. Would you and your sister be interested in speaking to them?" Epilogue. Neil was running through the darkness. Lightning flashed, illuminating a hateful sky and furious whitecaps out in the middle of the lake. Wind whipped his hair away from his face as thunder struck, sending his heart into a frenzy. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the flashlight in the distance behind them growing ever closer. The only way out was through the reeds at the water's edge. He knew what would happen if he went that way, but what choice did he have? He was barefoot and bleeding, and the man was nearly at his heels. Neil stumbled into the shallows and immediately fell forward. The reeds bent and caught him, and he managed to find his footing before landing on his face. Over his shoulder, the bobbing light was closer. He heard the fall of heavy boots approaching. "Just get out past the weeds," he told himself. "The open water will be safe. He can't reach you there." Neil pushed forward only to find the slimy stalks wrapping around his ankles again. This always happened. The nightmare was always the same. So why didn't he learn? "Rebecca!" The voice bellowed in the space directly behind him. "I'm not Rebecca," Neil wanted to call out. but a blow to his shoulder knocked him down. He sunk below the water. It filled his nose and mouth, and he choked. Fuzzy strands of lakeweed caught his wrists. The more he struggled, the tighter they became. He tried to spin, to see the face of the man who'd been chasing him, but the flashlight struck the water surface from above, obscuring what was behind it. His clenched lungs grew weary, exhausted. Let it go, he thought. Give up. Drown. It's what happened to her. It's what always happens. Neil hadn't dreamed about Rebecca Smith in a long time. Images of her death had disappeared from his imagination several months ago. Now that he was back in Hedston, the memories had returned. The chase had been only one of many dreams in which she'd haunted him. The worst was the dream in which he clung to the edge of the broken floor in Graylock's ballroom. Rebecca stood over him, glaring at him as she raised her foot and brought it down. He'd always wake with the start, the same question running through his head. Why, Rebecca? Why? He'd done as she'd asked, followed her glowing breadcrumbs along the twisted trail, and his reward had been her betrayal. Why? Maybe she'd been blinded by her hatred of Andy, by her need for revenge. Maybe she wanted to give up, but something in her nature, or nature itself, hadn't allowed it. Neil was familiar with this problem. His mother had recently told him, "We ask our brain to stop worrying, stop obsessing, stop dreaming the same scary dreams again and again, but our brains rarely take requests." He'd become resigned to the idea that he'd never know why Rebecca had done what she'd done. And so the dreams had come, presenting the question again and again. He wondered if Rebecca was sending them to him, but he also took comfort in knowing that sometimes dreams are just dreams. In the water, in the dream, he yanked his wrists up and around. The light from above grew brighter as the weeds tightened even more. His fingertips began to feel numb. The cold seeped into his skin, injecting him with a chill he felt he'd never escape. His chest began to ache as his lungs begged for air. His skin cried out as those familiar pins and needles stuck him over and over. This wasn't supposed to happen. This felt real, not dreamlike at all. He opened his mouth to scream for help, but all that sounded was a pathetic cry muffled by bubbles. If he didn't get air soon, he'd die. He knew this was true. With eyes open wide, he glanced around in the darkness for something to use to cut himself loose. There was nothing except emptiness and water and the beyond. Then a pale face appeared several yards away. As it came closer, he struggled even more. Rebecca's blue eyes looked into his own. Her dark hair swirled around her face, lifted by invisible currents. Her mouth was pulled back in an amused and terrible smile. As she reached out for him, Neil screamed again. But then she touched him. Her fingers encompassed her captured wrists, and Neil felt a strange quiet. The smile she wore wasn't terrible at all. Had it ever been? "Be still," she said. Her voice was sweet, echoing in the dark water as it would down a long hallway. Neil stopped moving and watched in amazement as the weeds loosened, then fell away. The cold abated, and he found he no longer needed to draw air. He felt no pain. He hovered in the darkness with Rebecca, the girl he'd come to fear more than anything in his life, which was saying a lot. She stared at him as if in wonder, her mouth open as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. He knew he had something to ask her, but his mind had gone blank. He looked into her eyes, and the word came. Why? Rebecca's face drew in on itself, a look of profound shame. If she'd been capable of spilling tears, Neil understood that she would have filled the lake with salt water. "I'm sorry," she said. "Forgive me." Was this enough? After everything she put him through? He thought of his mother, of how difficult it had been for her to come so far, and she'd had help. Rebecca had been alone for such a long time before she'd found someone who might understand. She'd chosen him, and he'd chosen to listen. Was this enough? Probably not. But if he were to listen to her now, he would need to make another choice, to forgive. Surprising himself, he nodded slightly. Rebecca's mouth curled into a sad smile. They stayed that way for several more moments, holding hands in the darkness. Then Rebecca glanced toward the surface. When Neil looked up, he noticed that the lights from above appeared to have changed. Instead of bobbing like a flashlight beam, the illumination cast a diffuse glow that fell through the water like the moon's silver gaze. She looked once more into his eyes and said, "Thank you, Neil." She raised his hands and kicked for the surface. Quickly, he realized there was no surface. They were floating in a darkness deeper than the one at Graylock Lake, and he knew that the light was further away than the moon was from the earth. Rebecca appeared to grow small as she ascended into an illusion of distance. When both she and the mysterious silver light had finally gone, Neil woke up. All was dark, and for a moment he had a difficult time distinguishing this room, but soon his eyes made out the bedpost near his feet. He was at the aunt's house. It was November, the night before he and Bree and Eric and Wesley went back to Graylock Island to film the interview with ghostly investigators. Neil sat up, filled with a discomforting, unnameable emotion. Someone sat on the end of his bed, a hunched shadow, long hair falling past her shoulders, hiding her face. Neil gasped. The figure reached out and touched his leg. "It's just me." "Bree? Who else?" Rebecca's face flashed through his mind. Neil felt for his sister's hand. "I just had the strangest dream," he said. Bree sniffed. "Why do you think I'm here?" Neil bit his lip. "She came to you too?" Even in the darkness, he saw her nod. He considered what this meant. So many things. "She apologized," Bree said. "Why does he wait so long?" "I don't know. Maybe she needed us close by in Headston." "Yeah, or maybe she was scared of what we'd say if she tried." How odd it was to think of a ghost being scared. He supposed he had Bree to thank for that. "Either way, I don't think she'll be visiting us again," said Bree. Neil had imagined that hearing those words come from his sister's mouth would have filled him with a sense of joy, but they didn't. "Shove over," said Bree, laying down on top of the covers. Neil made room. Together, they stared silently at the dark ceiling for a long while, listening to the creaking, cracking sounds that came naturally at night in an old house. By the time the pale dawn light began to filter through the bedroom's gauzy curtains, Neil had stumbled upon a deep and welcome sleep in which his dreams were finally his own. And that is Ghost of Graylock by Dan Poblocki.